The most dangerous moment in a marriage is not when people stop talking. It is when one person starts telling the truth everywhere except at home. My name is Owen Bradford, and the night everything changed began so normally that I almost missed it. It was a Thursday in late September, the kind of Texas evening where the heat finally starts surrendering to fall. I spent the entire day moving between construction sites, reviewing schedules, checking inspections, and solving problems that seemed to multiply every hour. By the time I turned into my neighborhood, the sun was sinking behind rows of oak trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. All I wanted was a shower, a cold drink, and a quiet evening. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several unfamiliar cars parked along the curb. Melissa had friends over. That was not unusual. She enjoyed hosting gatherings, book clubs, wine nights, birthday celebrations, neighborhood events. Our house had become a regular meeting place over the years. I grabbed my laptop bag, stepped out of the truck, and headed toward the front door. Before I even reached the porch, I could hear laughter drifting through the windows. The sound made me smile at first. Then I opened the door. Warm light spilled into the entryway. Music played softly somewhere in the living room. I took 2 steps inside before hearing Melissa's voice rise above the others. The moment I heard my name, I stopped moving. Not because I intended to listen, because something in her tone made it impossible not to. Honestly, she said, every day with Owen feels like a mistake. The room erupted with laughter. My hand tightened around the strap of my laptop bag. For a second, I convinced myself I had misunderstood. Maybe it was part of a story. Maybe I had missed the beginning. Then another voice asked, "If it is that bad, why are you still married to him?" More laughter followed. Melissa answered immediately. There was no hesitation, no discomfort, no sign that she considered the question difficult. "Because leaving is complicated," she said. "But if I could skip all the mess and wake up tomorrow with a different life, I probably would." Someone whistled. Someone else laughed even harder. Standing there in the shadows of my own hallway, I felt something inside me become very still. The strange thing was that I did not feel anger. Not right away. I felt clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when a puzzle piece finally falls into place after years of confusion. Through the opening to the living room, I could see Melissa sitting comfortably in an armchair with a wine glass in one hand. Her friends surrounded her. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody seemed surprised. That realization hurt more than her words. If everyone laughed, then everyone already knew. The conversation continued. Melissa joked about my routines. She joked about how predictable I had become. She joked about my long work hours. Each comment drew another round of laughter. Listening from the hallway felt like watching someone describe a stranger who happened to share my name. I glanced toward a framed family photograph hanging beside the staircase. We were smiling in the picture, standing together during a vacation in Colorado 3 years earlier. Looking at that photograph, I found myself wondering when the version of us in that image had disappeared. More importantly, I wondered why I had not noticed it happening. I should have walked into the room. I should have said something. Instead, I quietly stepped backward, opened the front door, and walked outside again. The evening air felt cooler now. I sat inside my truck without starting the engine. Through the windows of the house, I could still see movement and laughter. Nobody knew I had been there. Nobody knew I had heard any of it. For several minutes, I simply sat and watched the lights glowing behind the curtains. At the time, I thought I was witnessing the end of my marriage. What I did not realize was that I was finally seeing the truth of it. And once a truth like that reveals itself, there is no way to pretend you never heard it. I did not go back into the house that night. Instead, I started the truck and drove without any real destination in mind. The streets were quiet. Storefronts glowed beneath streetlights. Traffic lights changed colors for almost nobody. I drove for nearly 30 minutes before pulling into a small diner off the highway. It was the kind of place that never seemed to close. A neon sign buzzed softly above the entrance. A few pickup trucks sat scattered throughout the parking lot. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled food filled the air. I slid into a booth near the window and ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress smiled politely and left me alone. For a long time, I simply stared through the glass. Cars passed by. A young couple laughed while sharing dessert at another table. An older man read a newspaper near the counter. Everything around me looked completely normal. That was the strange part. My life felt like it had just shifted beneath my feet, yet the rest of the world continued exactly as it always had. As I sat there, I replayed Melissa's words over and over again. Every day with him feels like a mistake. The sentence echoed in my mind. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded honest. That realization bothered me more than anything else. If she had been angry, I could have explained it away. If she had been frustrated, I could have understood. But what I heard in her voice was something else entirely. It sounded like certainty. Around 10 o'clock, my phone lit up. Melissa was calling. I stared at the screen until the call ended. A minute later, another call arrived. Then a text message. "Where are you? Everything okay?" I did not answer. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because I genuinely did not know what to say. For years, I had been the person who fixed problems. If a project fell behind schedule, I fixed it. If an employee needed help, I handled it. If something went wrong at home, I found a solution. Sitting in that diner, I realized I had spent so much time solving everyone else's problems that I never stopped to ask whether some problems were actually mine to solve. My name is Owen Bradford. I am 46 years old, and I own a construction company that I built from nothing. 15 years earlier, I had one truck, a handful of tools, and more determination than experience. Slowly, project by project, the business grew. New employees joined. Larger contracts followed. The company became successful. Every achievement required sacrifice. Early mornings, long days, missed weekends, endless responsibility. Through all of it, I believed I was building security for my family. I believed the effort mattered. Maybe that was why I ignored so many warning signs. As the night grew later, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments I barely noticed at the time. Melissa rolling her eyes when I talked about work. Melissa laughing when her friends called me predictable. Melissa comparing me to husbands who traveled more, spent more, or seemed more exciting. Individually, none of those moments seemed important. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Around midnight, I ordered another coffee. The waitress gave me a sympathetic smile. Outside, the parking lot lights reflected across the wet pavement from a brief evening shower. I looked down at my phone again. 3 more messages waited. The last one simply said, "Please call me." I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of proving my value. Tired of pretending everything was fine whenever it clearly was not. My father used to tell me that people reveal who they truly are when they believe there are no consequences for their words. Sitting alone in that diner, I could not stop thinking about that lesson. Melissa never expected me to hear her, which meant the version of her I heard that night might have been the most honest version of all. And once that possibility entered my mind, another question quickly followed. If she felt comfortable speaking that way in front of her friends, how long had she been feeling it before I accidentally heard it for myself? The next morning, I woke up in a motel room on the edge of town. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across the carpet. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the memory returned. The laughter, the conversation, the certainty in Melissa's voice. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. 8 missed calls. 5 text messages. Every one of them from her. The first messages sounded concerned. The later ones sounded frustrated. "Where are you? Please call me. Owen, this is not funny. We need to talk." I set the phone down and walked toward the window. Outside, a few cars moved through the parking lot while a delivery truck backed into a loading area across the street. Everything looked ordinary, yet I felt like I was looking at my life through a completely different lens. After a quick shower, I drove straight to the office. The company yard was already busy. Crews were loading equipment. Supervisors reviewed schedules. Forklifts moved supplies across the lot. The familiar activity usually grounded me. Today it felt distant. I unlocked my office, stepped inside, and closed the door behind me. For the first hour, I buried myself in work. Contracts, budgets, site reports. Then, while searching a filing cabinet for an old permit, I noticed something pushed toward the back of a drawer. A black notebook. The sight of it immediately caught my attention. Months earlier, I had started writing things down. Nothing dramatic, just observations. Small moments that felt strange at the time, but never seemed important enough to discuss. I pulled the notebook out and flipped through the pages. The first entry was nearly 9 months old. Melissa seemed irritated when I talked about expanding the business. Another entry appeared 3 weeks later. Melissa laughed when her friend called me predictable, did not defend me. Then another. Increasing questions about company ownership and finances. Reading those notes felt like listening to a version of myself I had ignored. Each observation seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to miss. Around noon, I leaned back in my chair and stared through the office window. Employees crossed the yard below. A crane operator guided equipment into position. Life continued moving forward. Yet every page of that notebook seemed to pull me backward through time. I remembered dinners where Melissa barely looked up from her phone. I remembered parties where she spoke enthusiastically with everyone except me. I remembered moments when she compared me to other husbands and disguised the criticism as humor. At the time, I told myself every marriage goes through difficult seasons. Looking back, I realized I had confused hope with denial. The notebook contained another entry that stopped me cold. If things ever get worse, focus on facts, not feelings. I stared at those words for a long time. I did not even remember writing them. Yet they felt more relevant than ever. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. It was my operations manager asking about a project timeline. We spent 15 minutes discussing schedules and inspections before he left. The conversation reminded me of something important. Not every part of my life was falling apart. The company still functioned. My responsibilities still mattered. My future still existed. When the door closed again, I looked back at the notebook one last time. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. The conversation I overheard had not created a problem. It had revealed one. Whatever was happening between Melissa and me had started long before that evening. I simply had not wanted to see it. As the afternoon sun shifted across the office floor, I closed the notebook and placed it on my desk. For the first time since leaving the house, I stopped asking myself what Melissa meant by her words. Instead, I started asking a different question. If I had been noticing warning signs for nearly a year, what other truths had I been standing too close to recognize? That evening, after everyone had left the office, I remained alone behind my desk. The building was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sound of traffic outside. The black notebook sat open beside me. For most of the afternoon, I had been reading old entries and revisiting memories I once dismissed. Now another memory kept pushing its way to the surface. About 7 months earlier, Melissa had started asking unusual questions. At the time, they seemed harmless. She wanted to know more about the business, how ownership worked, how contracts were structured, what would happen if I ever retired. I remember feeling pleased that she suddenly seemed interested. Looking back, I realized I might have misunderstood the reason. As the sun faded behind the office windows, I pulled open a different drawer and found an old folder filled with business records. The sight of it brought back a conversation I had almost forgotten. Nearly a year earlier, after several uncomfortable weeks at home, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, Daniel Pierce. Daniel had handled legal matters for my company for years. Practical, careful, not the kind of person who exaggerated anything. At the time, I told myself the meeting was purely business. The truth was more complicated. Something inside me had already started noticing changes I could not fully explain. I still remember walking into Daniel's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The conference room overlooked downtown Austin. Traffic crawled through wet streets below while clouds covered the skyline. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing ownership records, business protections, succession planning, and financial structures. Nothing dramatic happened during that meeting. No shocking discovery. No urgent warning. Daniel simply encouraged me to keep everything organized and updated. Responsible business owners do that all the time. I followed his advice. Over the following months, documents were reviewed. Records were updated. Agreements were refreshed. Everything remained completely legal, transparent, and routine. Yet sitting alone in my office now, I realized those decisions mattered far more than I understood at the time. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable another realization became. Long before I overheard Melissa's conversation, some part of me had already sensed trouble approaching. Not enough to end a marriage. Not enough to accuse anyone of anything. Just enough to prepare. Around 8 o'clock, I finally left the office and drove toward home. The sky had turned dark. Streetlights reflected across the windshield. For most of the drive, I kept replaying old conversations in my head. The jokes. The criticism disguised as humor. The comparisons. None of them seemed significant when they happened. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. When I arrived at the house, Melissa's car was already in the driveway. Light spilled from the kitchen windows onto the front walk. I sat in my truck for a moment without moving. Part of me knew a conversation was waiting inside. Another part was not ready for it yet. Eventually, I walked through the front door. The house felt unusually quiet. Melissa was sitting alone at the kitchen island with a glass of water in front of her. She looked up immediately. Relief crossed her face for a brief moment before frustration replaced it. "Where have you been?" she asked. I set my keys on the counter. "Working." The answer was technically true. She crossed her arms. "You disappeared." I nodded slowly. I needed time to think. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence stretched between us. Normally, I would have rushed to fill it. Normally, I would have explained myself. Instead, I simply stood there. Melissa looked uncomfortable. That alone felt unusual. For years, our difficult conversations followed the same pattern. She criticized. I explained. She complained. I apologized. Somehow, every disagreement ended with me trying to fix something. This time was different. She began talking about communication, about distance, about how unhappy she had been lately. Some of her points were fair. I listened carefully. But as she spoke, I noticed something important. Every problem seemed to have one source. Me. Every disappointment traced back to my decisions. Every frustration connected to my shortcomings. Listening to her felt like reading half a story. As the conversation continued, a strange sense of calm settled over me. For the first time, I was not trying to win an argument. I was trying to understand reality. And the more I listened, the more convinced I became that there were still pieces of the truth I had not uncovered yet. The conversation continued long after the kitchen clock passed 9 o'clock. Melissa sat across from me beneath the warm glow of the pendant lights while shadows stretched across the hardwood floor. For years, moments like this followed a familiar script. She would explain why she was unhappy. I would search for solutions. She would list frustrations. I would promise improvements. Somehow, every difficult conversation became another assignment for me to complete. Tonight felt different. Not because Melissa had changed, because I had. She continued talking about distance, routine, and disappointment. She talked about how predictable life had become. She talked about opportunities she felt she had missed. She talked about dreams that never happened. I listened carefully. The more she spoke, the more I noticed something missing. There was no curiosity about my perspective. No questions about how I felt. No interest in understanding my side of the story. It was as if our marriage existed entirely through the lens of her experience. Eventually, she sighed and looked away toward the dark kitchen window. "I do not know how much longer I can keep doing this," she said quietly. The sentence settled into the silence between us. A year earlier, those words would have terrified me. 6 months earlier, they would have launched another desperate effort to repair whatever was broken. Tonight, they produced a different reaction. Calm. Not because I no longer cared. Because I was finally beginning to see reality clearly. I thought about the notebook in my office. I thought about the comments I overheard. I thought about the months of subtle warnings I kept explaining away. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Melissa had already emotionally stepped away from the marriage long before either of us admitted it. The only difference was that I had finally caught up to where she already was. She looked back at me, apparently expecting an argument or explanation. Instead, I simply nodded. The reaction seemed to surprise her. "That is all you have to say?" she asked. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "What would you like me to say?" Her expression tightened. "I do not know. Something." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Outside, a car passed down the street. Ordinary sounds suddenly felt unusually loud. Melissa folded her arms. "You have been acting strange ever since you disappeared." I almost smiled at the irony. Strange. The word lingered in my mind. From her perspective, refusing to follow the old pattern probably did seem strange. For years, I had carried responsibility for every emotional storm that entered our marriage. Now I was simply sitting there listening. "Maybe I have been paying attention," I said. She frowned. "What does that mean?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the dining room. A sideboard cabinet stood against the wall near a framed family photograph taken years earlier. Inside one of the drawers sat a large manila envelope. It had been there for months. Not hidden, not secret, just waiting. I opened the drawer and looked down at it. Suddenly, I remembered the day I placed it there. Back then, I told myself I would probably never need it. I hoped I never would. Behind me, Melissa's voice broke the silence. "Owen." I picked up the envelope and carried it back toward the table. Her eyes followed it immediately. Confusion replaced irritation. "What is that?" she asked. I placed the envelope carefully on the tabletop. The sound echoed softly through the room. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Melissa stared at it. Then she looked at me. The confidence she carried throughout the conversation seemed slightly weaker now. "What is in there?" she asked again. I rested one hand on the envelope and met her eyes. For the first time in years, I felt no need to defend myself, explain myself, or convince anyone of my worth. "You said you do not know how much longer you can keep doing this," I said quietly. "The truth is, neither can I." The look that crossed Melissa's face in that moment told me she still believed she understood exactly what was happening. What she did not realize was that the envelope sitting between us contained the first piece of a future she never saw coming. Melissa stared at the envelope for several seconds before finally reaching for it. The confidence she had carried throughout the evening was still visible, but something else had appeared beneath it. Uncertainty. It was subtle. The slight hesitation in her hand. The way she glanced at me before touching the papers. The way her expression tightened as she opened the flap. Slowly, she pulled out the documents and began reading. The kitchen remained silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I watched her eyes move across the first page, then the second, then back to the first again. For the first time that evening, she seemed completely focused. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "You are serious?" she asked. The question almost surprised me. The paperwork sitting in front of her answered that question more clearly than I ever could. Yet I understood why she asked it. Sometimes people ask questions when reality arrives faster than they expected. "Yes," I said calmly. Melissa stared at me for another moment before letting out a short laugh. It was not a joyful laugh. It sounded more like someone trying to convince themselves that a situation remained under control. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You are making a huge decision because of one bad week." I shook my head. "This is not about 1 week." She folded her arms. "Then what is it about?" For a few seconds I considered telling her everything. I considered describing the hallway, the laughter, the conversation she never knew I heard. But something stopped me. Not because I wanted to protect her, because I realized those words were only symptoms of a much larger problem. "It is about a long time," I answered. "A very long time." Melissa looked frustrated. "I do not understand what happened to you." That statement lingered in the air between us. The truth was that nothing had suddenly happened to me. I had simply stopped ignoring things I already knew. For years, I had explained away every uncomfortable feeling, every warning sign, every moment that left me questioning whether we were still moving in the same direction. Now I was finally looking at those moments honestly. Melissa picked up the documents again and flipped through several pages. The more she read, the less confident she seemed. "How long have you had these?" she asked. "A while." "Why?" Her voice sounded quieter now. "I thought about the notebook in my office. I thought about my meeting with Daniel months earlier. I thought about all the small instincts I kept dismissing. Because sometimes preparation is not the same thing as intention," I said. "I hoped I would never need them." She looked down at the papers again. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Outside, a car drove past the house. Its headlights briefly swept across the kitchen ceiling before disappearing into the darkness. Melissa eventually placed the documents back on the table. "I think you are overreacting," she said. The words might have affected me once. Tonight they felt strangely distant. Not because they were cruel, because they no longer mattered. For years I had depended on her agreement to validate my feelings. Now I was beginning to understand that I did not need permission to trust my own experience. She continued talking, explaining why every marriage struggles, explaining why people say things they do not mean, explaining why difficult seasons eventually pass. Some of what she said was reasonable. Some of it was even true. Yet something important remained absent. Responsibility. Every explanation focused on why the situation should not matter. None focused on why it happened in the first place. Eventually, she stopped speaking and looked directly at me, waiting, expecting me to retreat, expecting me to become the version of Owen she had known for years, the version who apologized first, the version who accepted blame, the version who kept carrying the entire weight of every conversation. Instead, I remained silent. The silence seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. As the minutes passed, I realized something important. The papers inside that envelope were not the turning point. The turning point had happened much earlier. It happened the moment I stopped trying to convince someone to value what they had already decided to overlook. And judging by the look in Melissa's eyes, she was only beginning to realize that the man sitting across from her was no longer willing to play the role she expected. The weeks that followed moved forward with a strange combination of speed and routine. Once the paperwork entered the system, life became less emotional and more procedural. Meetings were scheduled, documents were exchanged, deadlines appeared on calendars. The process seemed almost ordinary from the outside. Yet beneath the surface, everything was changing. Every morning I arrived at the office before sunrise. Every evening I returned to a house that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Somewhere along the way, I stopped measuring progress by legal milestones and started measuring it by what I was learning. The first major surprise came during a meeting with Daniel Pierce. We sat together in a conference room overlooking downtown Austin, while afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings outside. Daniel reviewed several folders containing financial disclosures, ownership records, and business documents. Most of the discussion was routine. Then he paused and adjusted his glasses. Whenever Daniel paused like that, it usually meant something important was coming. He explained that Melissa's legal team had requested extensive information regarding company ownership, future projections, operational structures, and asset documentation. The request itself was not unusual. What surprised him was the level of detail. As he continued speaking, memories from the previous year began fitting together in ways they never had before. The questions Melissa had asked, her sudden interest in business matters, her curiosity about ownership structures. At the time, I assumed she simply wanted to understand the company better. Looking back, the conversations felt different. Not sinister, not deceptive, just purposeful. Daniel opened another folder and began reviewing records we had updated months earlier. Ownership agreements, corporate protections, business planning documents. Everything had been organized long before any of this began. Nothing hidden, nothing complicated, just careful preparation. As the meeting continued, I realized something important. Many assumptions depend on incomplete information. People often believe they understand an entire situation when they have only seen a small part of it. A month later, we attended our first formal mediation session. The conference room was modern and quiet. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. Water bottles sat neatly arranged on a polished table, surrounded by stacks of folders and legal pads. Melissa arrived with her attorney. I arrived with Daniel. At first, the conversation focused on ordinary topics: property, accounts, household logistics. The discussion remained professional and respectful. Then attention shifted toward the business. Melissa's attorney spoke confidently about valuations and projections. He referenced future growth and estimated earnings. Throughout the conversation, Melissa appeared calm. In fact, she seemed more relaxed than I had seen her in months. Watching her, I realized she still believed she understood exactly how everything would unfold. Then Daniel began presenting documentation. One file led to another. Records, agreements, corporate structures, planning decisions made long before anyone imagined sitting in that room. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Yet the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Questions became more careful. Assumptions became less certain. Discussions that previously moved quickly suddenly slowed down. I noticed Melissa reading documents more closely than before. Her attorney requested additional copies. Certain expectations seemed to shift in real time. The entire room remained professional, but the confidence that existed at the beginning of the meeting was no longer the same. After nearly 4 hours, the session finally ended. People gathered their folders and prepared to leave. As I stood near the elevator lobby, Melissa approached me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The months after that mediation session felt strangely quiet. Not because the process had become easier, but because the uncertainty that once consumed me had finally started fading. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer spending my energy trying to understand what was happening. I understood. The questions that kept me awake at night had been answered. The confusion that followed me through workdays and weekends had slowly been replaced by clarity. Every week brought another meeting, another document, another update from attorneys. Yet the emotional weight continued getting lighter. The marriage was ending, but the constant struggle to make sense of it had already ended. Around that time, I began noticing changes in Melissa. At first they were small. Her emails became shorter. Her confidence seemed less certain. Conversations that once felt rehearsed now sounded more thoughtful. One afternoon she called about a scheduling matter involving the house. The discussion was simple and practical. We talked about furniture, storage, and timelines. Then a long silence settled between us. Finally, she asked a question I did not expect. Do you ever think about how we got here? I looked out the office window toward the equipment yard where crews were loading trucks beneath the bright Texas sun. The question lingered for several seconds before I answered. Yes, I said. More than I used to. Another silence followed. Then she quietly said, Me too. After the call ended, I sat at my desk thinking about those two words. Me too. For years, it felt like we had been living in completely different versions of the same marriage. Now, for the first time, it seemed possible that we were both finally looking at the same reality. A few weeks later, I attended a neighborhood gathering I normally would have skipped. Families filled backyards beneath strings of lights. Children chased each other across freshly cut grass. People stood around outdoor tables, sharing food and stories. Nothing about the evening was remarkable. Yet standing there with a paper plate in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other, I noticed something unexpected. I felt relaxed, completely relaxed. There was no pressure, no tension, no need to explain myself, no need to convince anyone of anything. I had become so accustomed to carrying emotional strain that I forgot what life felt like without it. Several neighbors stopped to talk. Some asked about work. Others discussed football, weather, and upcoming community events. Nobody treated me differently. Nobody seemed interested in taking sides. They simply spoke to me the way they always had. As Owen. Not as a husband. Not as someone going through a divorce. Just Owen. The realization stayed with me long after the evening ended. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed my identity to become connected to a relationship that no longer reflected who I was. Letting go of that connection felt painful at first. Eventually, it felt freeing. During another mediation update several weeks later, Melissa seemed different again. Less defensive, less focused on outcomes, more reflective. At one point, she looked across the conference table and asked, Were you unhappy for a long time? The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. Not unhappy, I said. Hopeful. She lowered her eyes toward the table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I added, I kept believing things would become what they used to be. The room fell quiet. Looking back, that conversation may have been one of the most honest exchanges we had in years. Not because it solved anything. Because nobody was trying to win. We were simply acknowledging the truth. As I drove home that evening beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun, I realized something important. The hardest part of this entire experience was never losing the marriage. The hardest part was accepting that it had changed long before either of us admitted it. And once I finally accepted that truth, I found something I never expected waiting on the other side. Peace. Still, one final lesson remained before this chapter of my life would truly come to an end. Almost a year after the night that changed everything, I found myself standing on the back porch of a different house with a cup of coffee in my hand as the first light of morning spread across the Texas sky. The air was cool. A gentle breeze moved through the trees beyond the fence. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler clicked steadily across a lawn. The world felt quiet in a way I had not experienced for a very long time. The legal process was over. The paperwork was finished. The meetings, negotiations, and difficult conversations belonged to the past. What remained was something I never expected to find at the end of all of it. Peace. Not excitement. Not triumph. Just peace. Looking back, I realized the biggest change was not my address, my schedule, or even my relationship status. The biggest change was the way I saw myself. For years, I believed being a good husband meant working harder, sacrificing more, staying patient longer, and carrying every burden without complaint. I thought endurance alone could save a relationship. What I eventually learned was that no amount of effort can replace mutual respect. Relationships need two people moving in the same direction. When one person keeps walking while the other has already stopped, the distance grows whether anyone admits it or not. The construction company continued growing. New projects replaced old ones. Employees came and went. Deadlines appeared and disappeared. Life moved forward the way life always does. The difference was that I no longer woke up each day trying to earn value from someone who had already stopped recognizing it. Friends told me I seemed lighter, more relaxed, healthier. At first, I dismissed those comments. Then one afternoon, I found an old photograph from several years earlier. The man in that picture looked tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. He looked like someone carrying responsibilities that were never entirely his to carry. For the first time, I understood what everyone else had been seeing. Every now and then, I thought about Melissa. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just perspective. The truth is that people change. Sometimes they change together. Sometimes they do not. The mistake we made was pretending the distance between us did not exist. If there is one lesson I would take from everything that happened, it is this. Reality becomes easier to face the moment you stop negotiating with it. The hardest part was never the divorce itself. The hardest part was accepting the truth long before the paperwork arrived. One Saturday morning, while organizing boxes in my home office, I found the black notebook that had followed me through the entire journey. I sat down and slowly flipped through the pages. The observations, the questions, the moments that felt insignificant when I wrote them down. Looking at them now, I could see the story clearly. The signs had always been there. I simply was not ready to understand them. I closed the notebook and placed it on a shelf. Some chapters deserve to remain closed once their lessons have been learned. As the sun climbed higher above the horizon, I finished my coffee and looked across the quiet neighborhood. A year earlier, I thought I was losing everything. In reality, I was rediscovering something I should never have misplaced in the first place. My self-respect. And sometimes the ending you fear most becomes the beginning you need most. Before this story ends, I would genuinely like to know what you think. If you had been standing in that hallway and heard those words, how would you have responded? Would you have walked into the room immediately, or would you have handled it differently? Your perspective matters because every experience teaches something valuable. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, difficult choices, and personal growth resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this one. As for me, I stepped back inside, closed the door behind me, and continued building a life that no longer depended on someone else's approval to feel complete.